Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Valerie, a Director of Ziptales. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. This webinar is all about punctuation, a quick overview of its history, a summary of the major rules, and a set of 18 original games to teach it, as well as other classroom activities. It has been prepared by Richard McRoberts. Richard is an experienced teacher of many years, as well as being a long-time author and editor. All participants will be emailed a PD certificate for attending today. If you're sitting around in a staff room with other staff, make sure you email us a list of all your staff members' names and emails of those who attend. The webinar will last for about 25 minutes of lecture and activity suggestions, followed by just under 5 minutes of question and answer. If you have any questions, please use the chat box option to the right of your screen. Let's get started.
Punctuation without pain. A way to teach punctuation using games as well as instruction. Years 3 to 6. Why punctuate? Because without it, meaning can be completely scrambled. Let's stay with Grandma. I like cooking, my grandmother, and my dog. I like cooking my grandmother and my dog. You don't think people could be that foolish? Do we know it all? Surely this is easy stuff. Well, a quiz. What are the following punctuation marks? Dinkus, crotchet, paragraph, asterism, fleuron, caret, tilde or twiddle, dingbat. The answers are on the last slide of this presentation. More importantly, do we all have total control over this convention? Do we have to teach it? Yes. Know that word contractions are a feature of informal language and that apostrophes of contraction are used to signal missing letters. Recognize how punctuation marks are used in text to signal dialogue, titles, and quoted or direct speech. Understand how the grammatical category of possessives is signaled through apostrophes and how to use apostrophes with common and proper nouns. Understand the uses of commas to separate clauses. Uses a range of text conventions, including most grammatical conventions, appropriately and with increasing accuracy. But which ones? The full list is too much all at once. I would suggest children need to master these by junior primary. Full stop, capital letter, question mark and comma. These by middle primary school, apostrophe, exclamation mark and quotation marks. These by senior primary, parentheses, brackets, colons, semicolons, hyphens, ellipsis, and the NM rule. Asterisks can be thrown in any time. However, the curriculum document suggests certain elements at certain grade levels, and these should take precedence. My only caution is that some things, for instance semicolons or N rules, are quite hard to explain, and as I will suggest later, are now considered by experts to be probably superfluous. I'd treat them with care and offer them as interesting extras, if at all. For N and M rules, see the instructions in the separate games document. How come it's all so complicated, and why do we call it punctuation anyway? Let's try a test. Punctuation, from the Greek, was based on which root word? The Greek for punch, point, pun, pull. Yes, you're right. The term comes from the word to point, as in a mark that is inserted to point to something significant. The basis of punctuation is the dot, the point itself. A short history of punctuation. Number 1, the unregulated wilderness of the ancients. In the early days of the English language, some 1600 years ago, when speech and scripture was first being written down in Old English, there was no punctuation. Here is an English inscription from 878 AD. It reads this way. It's a simple sentence in Old English and relates to the famous jewel presented to King Alfred the Great. But something's wrong with the sentence. There are no spaces, no punctuation marks of any kind, and every letter is a capital. If we insert spaces, a later invention, and translate it into modern English, we read, Alfred has ordered me to make this. We've come a long way since then. 2. The first reform, separation of words. In the beginning, reading and writing was for the privileged few, aristocrats, monks, and the like. It was a highly specialised skill requiring years of training. The idea of everyone being able to read would have been considered silly, so there was little need to make things easy. Paper, or more exactly vellum, parchment, was precious and scarce. Every part of the page was filled with words and pictures. Text would have been very hard to read, even for monks who were familiar with the Bible and well practised. If you weren't familiar with the passage, reading was impossibly difficult. So a reform was introduced, spaces between words. Here's what old text with spaces looked like. A simple idea, but essential. St. Augustine advised this reform to all literate people. 3. The second reform, periods and other pauses. Around the beginning of the Middle Ages, scribes and other professional readers were routinely making the job easier by adding in points or punctuation. The major ones that developed then were the punctus versus, or turned point, a long break, as at the end of a sentence. We now call this a full stop or period. It looked in those days like a modern semicolon. The punctus elevatus, rising point, a short break, as in the middle of the sentence, before going on. We now call this a comma. It looked in those days like an inverted semicolon. The punctus interrogativus, interrogation or question mark, a point or mark showing a question. We now call this a question mark. It looked then like a dot with a wavy line attached. The punctus exclamativus, exclamation point, a point showing that the voice should rise and become louder. We now call this an exclamation mark. It looked then like a right slanting colon with a tail. Here, for example, is the punctus versus, or full stop, circa 12th century. You can see the connection to our modern full stop, but this is some centuries away from what we know as the now standard modern form. It was only with the coming of the printing press and mass production of books 1450 onwards that these points, which had been in flux for centuries, settled into the forms we now know. At one time, scholars tried to impose a musical notation schema on the different points, arguing that the comma was one beat, a short pause, the colon 2 beats, or 2 commas, longer, the semicolon 2 colons, the full stop 2 semicolons. But this was impractical. Imagine waiting 8 beats to start the new sentence. In practice, the exact timing has always depended on the text and the reader. The full stop. This is the simplest of all the punctuation marks, and thank goodness easy to teach. It also constitutes nearly 50% of all punctuation, so the commonest is also the easiest. The Americans call them a period, from the Greek periodus, period of time. We call them full stops, after the printer's term, meaning the stop that marks the end of a sentence. The rules. Good news, only one, the original one. You must always use a full stop to mark the end of a sentence. For example, Walt Disney was born in 1901 and died in 1966. He won 22 Academy Awards. His corporation, with assets of $75 billion, is one of the most successful in the world. All the others you can forget. For a long time it was considered essential to mark abbreviations, as in Mr. S. Holmes, 221B, Baker Street, London, NW1, United Kingdom. But by the end of the 20th century it had become standard to do this. Mr. S. Holmes, 221 Baker Street, London, NW1, United Kingdom. No full stops. The key principle, explained by English linguist David Crystal in his excellent book, Making a Point, The Pernickety Story of English Punctuation, was clarity. Did the name and address make sense without the fussy full stops? Yes. So let them go. And that's what's happened. Modern usage also looks down on the overly complex use of stops in acronyms and abbreviations. Don't bother. Now some activities to teach or revise full stops. 1. Stop me now. 2 volunteer children are chosen to come out the front. One is the speaker, A, and one is the punctuator, B. A starts talking slowly. Whenever he comes to the end of a sentence, B holds up the full stop sign. If B misses one, the person who corrects becomes B. See the instructions. 2. Spot the dot. Unpunctuated text must be completed. 3. Scrambled sentences. A game in which words have to be put together and full stops added. For skill builders, there is a special lesson for full stops in skill builders with worksheets. 5. Specialised English lessons. The following units are devoted to punctuation. What is punctuation? Why punctuate? Making it read better, and refining editing skills. Capital letters. Capital letters are not strictly punctuation in the classic sense, but they are normally bundled in with the other points, because without them texts are utterly confusing, like this. Have a read. The caps are there not just out of politeness, but because they signal important people or items. It's interesting to note that in times gone by the practice was different. For instance, here is Robinson Crusoe in the first printed edition. I consulted several things in my situation which I found would be proper for me: first, health and fresh water, shelter from the heat of the sun, security from ravenous creatures, whether men or beasts. And even Jane Austen put capitals on significant common nouns, as in, Mrs. Clay's affections had overpowered her interest, and she had sacrificed for the young man's sake the possibility of scheming longer for Sir Walter. She has abilities, however, as well as affections. But by the mid-19th century, we had arrived at what we now see as the standard, which I now summarise. The rules. 1. A sentence must always begin with a capital letter. Here's an example. 2. All proper nouns must have a capital letter. An example. 3. The pronoun I must always be a capital letter. 4. Lines in poetry should all begin with a capital letter. Activities to teach or revise capital letters. 1. Add a cap. This game involves scrambled cards with a variety of words including common and proper nouns. 2. Spot the proper noun. This requires a set of cards on which both common and proper nouns appear. 3. Skill builders. There is a special lesson on capital letters in the Skill Builders suite. Commas. The word comes from the Greek komma, meaning a piece cut off. That is, the bit where the speech is broken or interrupted. A comma is to mark a short pause. This is the medieval punctus elevatus, the point that indicates a rising intonation, because the voice pauses on a high note, then drops and runs on beyond the comma. They are very old, and they are essential. In a standard survey of punctuation frequency, commas represent 46% of all marks. This is in contrast to full stops, 45%, also of major importance, and then the remaining ones at much lower frequencies. Semicolons at 2%, question marks 1%, colons at 0.9%, and exclamation marks 0.3%. The rules. 1. A comma is used to show a pause. For example, take a deep breath and try again. 2. A comma is used to mark off an introductory phrase. For example, once upon a time, there were 12 beautiful princesses. 3. A comma is used to separate clauses in a sentence. For example, everybody's favourite clause is the Santa Claus, which needs no further definition. 4. A comma is used to separate items in a list. For example, when you go to the supermarket, please bring me back eggs, milk, honey, bread, spaghetti, and the newspaper. Note, the so-called Oxford or serial comma breaks this rule, but it is quite controversial and I would not suggest teaching it to children. It inserts a comma before the and the final item in the list. For example, when you go to the supermarket, please bring me back eggs, comma, milk, comma, honey, comma, bread, comma, spaghetti, comma, and the newspaper. Even if children use it correctly, it can look like a mistake. 5. A comma is used before or after direct speech. For example, the teacher called out, "Where have you been?" In a sense, they're all a variation on Rule 1. Any short pause means a comma. However, given the way judgments can be made about proper usage, and this particularly applies to the 4th and 5th rules, it's best to teach them carefully anyway. Activities. 1. Crazy commas. Children work in groups. They take a set of ambiguous sentences and explain what is wrong with the inappropriate version. For example, I love my parents, Kylie Minogue, and Kermit the Frog. Or, I love my parents, Kylie Minogue, and Kermit the Frog. 2. Lists to go. Brainstorm lists on the board. Be imaginative. Then students must select and write out their own lists with commas added in. 3. Talking talk. This involves creating 1, a set of quotes, and 2, the typical intro and end clauses that embed them in sentences. For example, I said, come here. 4. Skill builders. There's a special lesson on commas in Skill Builders with worksheets. Apostrophes. The word comes from the Greek apostrophos, which means turning away in the sense of elision or deletion. It's an odd mark because it looks exactly like a comma, except that it floats above the line. And it causes a lot of trouble. There is a group in the UK called the Apostrophe Protection Society whose mission is to stamp out illicit uses of the mark. It's safe to say that teachers see these sorts of problems on a daily basis. The rules. 1. An apostrophe is used to show a contraction. For example, denial ain't just a river in Egypt, said Mark Twain. It's a joke, of course, but it shows the apostrophe. This usage of the apostrophe dates from 1559 and has been called formally, quote, the rejecting of a vowel from a word, unquote. It is normally 1 letter that's missing, but as long as the sense is clear, it can be more. 2. An apostrophe is used to show possession. For example, the school's apostrophe s rules are necessary and just. This usage goes back also to the 1500s, as in, did Romeo's hand shed Tybalt's blood? For a time, pronouns too were given apostrophes, but in the 1840s that fell away, leaving just one exception, one's apostrophe s, as in, one likes to keep one's toothbrush clean. Now only nouns are allowed to have possessive apostrophes. For example, the little girl's doll or Freddie's book. Of all the punctuation marks, apostrophes have the worst time of it. The so-called greengrocer's apostrophe, that is, accidental use where there's neither contraction nor possession, as in the sign T's apostrophe s, is unnecessary. A wag has dubbed this tendency apostrophitis, the tendency to insert apostrophes where none are needed, and it's remarkably common on signs and even on the internet. Activities. 1. Which one? Children look at correct and incorrect examples. 2 teams which have 5 seconds to spot the incorrect usage before ceding to the other team. 2. Outrageous apostrophes. This requires a bank of silly uses. It's meant to be fun, but also to promote understanding of right and wrong. 3. Contraction matchup. This requires a group of words with contractions, for example, isn't, and the full form is not. 4. Skill builders. There's a special lesson on apostrophes in Skill Builders with worksheets. Quotation marks. These date from the 1500s too. They took some time to develop, with the original form being a dipple symbol at the beginning of the quote only. By the 1700s, in a clever bit of multi-purposing, printers had taken another punctuation mark, the comma, and reused them above the line. We call them still, by the printer's term, inverted commas. With the rise in popularity of the novel, typesetters needed a way to make it clear someone was speaking and came up with this scheme. Inverted commas marked the beginning of the speech and uninverted commas marked the end. This convention is still with us 300 years later. Note, the Johnny Depp example shown here is technically called a vertical quote, or inverted comma, and the ones I have been mostly using are called curly or smart quotes. Should it be a single mark or a double? The standard usage these days is for doubles to be used for small children. The argument is that they are more obvious signs, and singles for people above middle to upper primary school. This, however, like so many other aspects of punctuation, is somewhat a matter of taste. In practice, Americans prefer doubles while the English prefer singles. But it's up to you, as long as the same style is used throughout. The rules. 1. Quotation marks are used for any piece of direct speech. For example, "You are old, Father William," the young man said, "and your hair has become very white, and yet you incessantly stand on your head. Do you think, at your age, it is right?" 2. Where the quotation is inside a sentence, it is separated from the rest of the sentence by a comma. For example, "He yelled out, 'Help.'" Note, other punctuation marks are required to be inside the quote, as in, "I called out, quote, 'Don't look now,' end quote." And this takes a fair bit of teaching. I recommend the Skill Builder lesson on quotation marks to make this task easier. Some activities. 1. A tale of two quotes. This activity requires children to look at and compare indirect and direct speech. For example, "He said to come here" versus "come here, he said." 2. Famous quotes. This is a fun one in which children compete to amuse one another with famous and even silly quotes. 3. Quotes and commas. This requires revision of the rules about quotes inside sentences. For example, "She said, come here." 4. Skill Builders. There's a special lesson on quotation marks in Skill Builders with worksheets. Colons and semicolons. The word colon comes from the Greek kolon, meaning limb or bit of a sentence. Now, it could be argued that they are a bit too sophisticated for children. The great authors use them, but the children need to. Maybe not, for they are very complicated, and modern authors tend not to use them as much. In most cases, a comma, full stop, or conjunction will do the same job. You choose. The rules. 1. A semicolon connects two or more independent clauses inside a sentence that are connected in their sense, but don't justify a new sentence in their own right. For example, "There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were bunches of grapes. There were piles of hazelnuts, mossy and brown. There were Norfolk apples, squat and worthy, beseeching to be carried home and eaten after dinner." 2. A colon is used to show that what follows sums up or explains further what has come before. For example, "She was delighted to have his proposal. It was the third time she had been asked, and she loved him dearly." Activities. 1. Colon or not colon. Children work with unpunctuated text which needs colons or semicolons. They can work in pairs or small groups. 2. What options? Semicolons can be replaced by other marks or by recombining and using conjunctions. 3. Simple or complex. This is a complex one looking at the sentence options and requires solid revision of sentence etiquette. And now, 2 activities that put them all together. General punctuation activities. 1. Punctuation by numbers. The teacher finds a passage with all the major marks, takes them out, and then has cards displayed. Children work out how many of each. 2. What else could it mean? A passage is given with an obvious meaning. How else could it be punctuated to give a different meaning? So finally, what are the following punctuation marks? Dinkus, crotchet, paraph or pilcrow, asterism, fleuron, caret, tilde or twiddle, dingbats. Thanks for your time today.
And now for some of your questions. Jackie from New South Wales would like to know, you mentioned quite a few punctuation marks, but are there priorities?
Thanks, Jackie. Clearly the curriculum itself is where you start, but in terms of emphasis and revision, I would suggest the ones which are hardest to get right are 2, commas and apostrophes. With commas, the most common problem is the use of the comma when a full stop is needed, as in, we went to the zoo, we saw the monkeys and the lions, we came back home. And with apostrophes, it's the overuse of them, apostrophitis, when, for example, it's a simple plural, as in, the girls, apostrophe S, went to the dance. In other words, a plural where they add an apostrophe for no good reason. Check out those lessons I mentioned. They take children through this thicket of rules and usage in careful stages.
And now one from Mark in Victoria. What about the Oxford comma?
Thanks, Mark. This is very contentious. An Oxford comma is where you add in an extra comma just before the end of a list, as in, we need to take a packed lunch, comma, a parka, comma, a light, comma, and sunscreen. Some experts recommend it. I think, despite the arguments, it's far too radical. It looks like a mistake, and I'd avoid it.
And Nancy from Queensland. What about single versus double quotes?
Yes, thanks for that question. A rough rule of thumb is that doubles are good for younger children so they can get used to them, and singles for older children. If you look at most books for younger children, they feature doubles. However, it's really up to you. The only strict rule is that having taught one or the other, children stick with that. Nothing looks worse than changing halfway through a passage.
And Philip in Tasmania. Are you recommending we don't teach colons and semicolons?
I think they're fine for really good writers, Philip, preferably in the senior years, but they require a lot of intense teaching. Semicolons in particular are quite tricky. The concept of independent clauses with a common theme, all adding up to a composite thought, is difficult to explain. If in doubt, teach them that they can achieve the same, with less pain, using full stops and conjunctions.
And lastly, Julie from South Australia. What are N and M rules?
Thanks, Julie. They are the long hyphens or dashes that can be put in to mark connection. As in, there are 3 children, all of them charming, whom I'll bring with me. So the N rule would go in between those clauses. There are 3 children, dash, all of them charming, dash, whom I'll bring with me. The N is the width of the letter N. The M is the length of the letter M, hence the name. Once again, you can achieve the same with commas or full stops. They aren't really necessary for children.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you, participants, for coming to this webinar. I hope it's been of help to you. A special list of game activities mentioned in this webinar will be sent out tomorrow to all participants. Don't forget that you will receive a special PD certificate for attending the webinar. To get that, you need to send in your email address with your full name and the name of your school to support@ziptales.com. These certificates will be sent out tomorrow. As you have heard, we recommend using key parts of Ziptales for this topic, particularly Skill Builders and the Specialised English Lessons Suite, a repository of 150 units covering all aspects of the literacy curriculum. If you are a Ziptales subscriber, you can go straight into these sections of the site. If you are new to Ziptales, Please sign up for a free trial to access these modules along with the rest of our site. Thanks again for attending Punctuation Without Pain.